Do you want to quickly introduce yourself for the recording?
Sure. I am Rachel Boillot. I graduated from Ride Country Day in 2005.
Oh, wow.
I know, that's crazy. And I'm a photographer and a photography professor at Arkansas State University.
That is awesome. Thank you. So my first question is sort of like your artistic journey. So describe your artistic journey, and from maybe like when you decided you wanted to go into the field that you're in, to whether your art style has sort of changed over the years, and as you've gotten more experience or as you began teaching, and your sort of journey into teaching.
That's all of it right there. Okay. My artistic journey began at Rye Country Day in high school. I did not think of myself as an artist, but I can't remember exactly how it works, but you have to take an art credit.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't love drawing. It's really not my thing. I love art, but I've always considered myself an observer of art. And then I realized, oh, I'm just an observer. But yeah, at Rye Country Day, the things that I really connected with that made a difference were I was able to take AP Art History. That had a huge impact, and I'm really grateful that that was something available to me in high school because I loved it. And photography was a complete surprise.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really was just like doing it to take a credit, and I knew some other people that liked black and white photography in the darkroom. It seemed kind of mysterious, so I thought I'd try it out, but it was really just to fulfill a requirement. And I got hooked. I spent a lot of hours in that darkroom. So much so that it like kind of quickly became almost questionable, like, what is this to me? You know, is this a hobby? Is this something I might want to pursue? And I would say during my time at Rye Country Day, I very much viewed it as a hobby, a personal passion, distinct from the pressures of the rest of my life, you know, figuring out what I wanted to do, what a career would be, where I wanted to go to college. It became my creative outlet. And for that reason, like I very much viewed it as something I cared about more than anything and was willing to spend more time on than anything. But it was for me, and that was important. And at that time, again, like it was all black and white film and darkroom. I shot digitally, like with friends to make snapshots, but not, you know, for me, photography was black and white darkroom. I got very, very lucky in that the next step for me is I went to Tufts for college. And they had a combined degree program with the Museum of Fine Arts, the School of the Museum of Fine Arts. I didn't know what a big deal that was going to be, because I mean, I didn't enroll in that program. But my freshman year at Tufts, again, like photography was my passion. It was what I was spending more time on than anything else by a far stretch. I mean, I was overnighting in the Tufts darkroom like 3 nights a week, which is,
oh my goodness.
Yeah, no, I was like crazy passionate about it. But again, like I was just taking one class, and then my other classes were like psychology, international relations, things that I thought were more practical and could lead to a career. And I actually became even more of the mind that photography needed to be a hobby, so that, because I was worried that if I made photography a career, it would sort of interfere with just sort of the unbridled passion I felt for it. Like what, I didn't even know what that would look like, but I just didn't want to do anything to destroy this thing that for me had become really, really important in terms of just a part of my identity and how I moved through the world. I guess, oh yeah, it was the spring semester, my freshman year. My photography professor at Tufts, he he basically made me apply to the combined degree program to transfer in. I mean, he didn't make me, but he walked in one morning at 7 o'clock. He was publishing a book and like needed to get it some very, he like wanted to work that morning. He was there early. I wasn't expecting him. I was taking a nap while my prints were in the wash because I'd been there all night.
Oh my goodness.
And he thought it was kind of funny. You
Mhm.
know, he didn't mind that, you know, I had been there all night. He was like, but why would you not get a degree in this? If you are spending this much time on this thing you love, why would you not get a degree?
Mhm.
And for me, one of the biggest things I had to overcome is something that, you know, has always been a part of me, but I think also was very ingrained in me. I said to him, I was like, how can this be anything but selfish? You know, because it just felt like at that moment, it was all about like me doing what I love. Like, how could I give back? How could I make an impact as a photographer? You
Mhm.
know, the desire to, you know, I've always been really, service has always been really important to me.
Mhm.
And that was definitely something that was part of my life at Rye Country Day as well. But he, you know, he sort of explained that there are a lot of ways you could do that, and shouldn't you at least give it a try if you were already here? Because with the combined degree, I would get a BFA and a BA.
Oh,
I would
that's
have to
awesome.
stay 1 year longer to complete both degrees undergrad.
Mhm.
So I did that. So I was in college 2005 to 2010. My class at Tufts graduated 2009, but a lot of them ended up, you know, working and living in Boston. So my community stayed, and I did the full combined degree program. And that was really what set me on my track. After, you know, as I got more and more into a formal course of study with photography, I ended up just loving it more. It didn't destroy my passion. It just made me think more critically about where I could take it and what I wanted to do with it. I definitely decided at age 19 that my decision to pursue photography as a profession was contingent on the ability to teach photography. Because
Mhm.
for me, that makes it more social. It's a way of giving back. It's a way of sharing my passion with others that sort of, it's definitely service. I can say that now that I'm a teacher, it's definitely service.
Uh-huh.
Um, it's a service job, and I love that. So for me, like choosing to pursue photography kind of went hand in hand with wanting to teach others photography so that they might sort of discover this thing that they hadn't known might be this thing for them. You know, like I just didn't, photography is one of those things you don't always know until you do it, like how much fun it can be and how much of an outlet, and also it's a lot more difficult than you think, you know. And that's that's what I'm up against now. All my students come in and they're like, so I'm just going to push a button, right? And I'm like,
Not quite.
yeah. We'll talk, there'll be a lecture first. um but yeah, so I got very lucky that there was that program at Tufts, and I feel very fortunate to sort of have fallen into that.
Mhm.
um at first, you know, I would say there was the decision to teach. I also was very interested in being an international photojournalist. I was very fortunate in that through Tufts, I got some early experiences doing so. Um, I published work that I made in Argentina. I went to Kashmir. And then I realized that just wasn't what I wanted to do. You
Mhm.
know, there are a lot, I realized that for me, I realized I wanted to be more engaged with where I live. You know, what about like rather than going to Kashmir, like what's happening in my neighborhood? Um, and I also realized that one of the difficulties and something something I still navigate surely, is, you know, as a journalist, you don't have creative control. Your editor does. And that changed how I felt about working as a photojournalist, because it can get tricky. And I felt like it was getting trickier with time, because it was getting to the point where, like, as soon as you could make a picture, it would be like wired back to an editor in New York. And it was just sort of like, it just felt like I felt uncomfortable telling people I was going to tell their stories, when really
It wasn't you.
it wasn't me.
Uh-huh.
And that was a deal breaker for me.
Mhm.
If I'm working on a story or photographing something I care about, I want creative control, because photography is something that the context really matters. The context really matters. You take 200 pictures, the one you choose says something different than another one.
Mhm.
So the process of selection and making decisions about how you're presenting something, like, all of that's really important. Image capture is just one part of the process. And as I learned that and understood that, I realized I would want to work independently. Um, my mother was also freaking out.
That is fair.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Um, but yeah, I got really into, I went to school at an interesting moment, in that I would say digital was really just becoming a thing at
Mhm.
the museum school when I went there. Um, I still printed in a color darkroom and shot color film. I did digital as well, but I also had the experience of working in the color darkroom, which is way more difficult than a black and white darkroom.
Really? I never thought there would be a difference.
Big difference. Uh, you know how in a black and white darkroom, like, they always look red, you've got that safe light?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, color darkroom, no light. I bang
Really?
my head a lot. Yeah, because color paper is sensitive to red light as well, all types of light.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it's completely dark?
Mhm. I
That's
spent a
crazy.
lot of time in there. It's really interesting. I think it taught me how to see color in a
Mhm.
very important way, though. But it's a very time consuming process. An exhibition print takes 3 hours minimum
Wow.
for like one, but that's like for like one big print that could go in a museum or gallery, like a perfect print. But I would say it takes, I would say that usually takes twice as long, the color dark room, as black and white.
Interesting.
Yeah.
On top of the fact you can't see.
Yeah. And then, but so what happened with me is, right before I graduated, they shut down the color darkroom and started doing digital inkjet printing. So I got that experience too. And I'm very glad that happened, because what I learned in the color darkroom was very interesting in terms of the experience and learning to see color, but it wasn't a sustainable practice in
Mhm.
terms of applying to what I do now. I haven't had access to a color darkroom since 2009. Um,
So sort of having that like experience as you were leaving became very helpful.
yeah. So, and then I graduated. I had no idea what I was going to do, because I had been training to work in a color darkroom, because I
Mhm.
was one of the best color darkroom printers at the museum school at the time. That ended up not really working out, but I got lucky, but also just work ethic, and I think Right Country Day really ingrained that in me, and that matters more than anything sometimes. I got this random internship, and I turned it into a full time. I worked hard enough and proved myself invaluable, so they created a job for me, and I was working at the Boston Housing Authority for a
Uh-huh.
few years, and they had this amazing archive of photographs from the 1930s that no one had seen. They were just sitting there in filing cabinets. It was a study that had been conducted in order to see if public housing would be necessary in Boston. So it's basically documentation of neighborhoods that were considered, the word used at the time was slums, and then those neighborhoods were demolished and rebuilt as public housing developments. So I was looking at the before pictures. which were very interesting historically. And it also made me think really critically about the history of my medium, which is a very real passion of mine, because why were these pictures not out in the public? You know, it made me realize like history is a game of winners, and unless you're a winner, which means have tons of funds, the history doesn't always get told. So it kind of became my mission to make this, to like digitize this archive and make it accessible so that people living in these public housing developments would also have access to see what was there before, also like all the pictures since the 30s.
That is so cool. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, I mean, the 2-month internship was totally random. The agency was celebrating its 75th anniversary, and Mayor Menino like wanted the housing authority to do something cool and celebratory, and they had no idea what to do. So they thought, I don't know, we've got these old pictures, maybe an art history intern. And I went in and I found the pictures really inspiring, and I decided to sort of make it a thing.
Wow, that is so cool.
Yeah. And then I would say, you know, at a certain point, I felt like once I had done what I wanted to do with the archive, creatively, it wasn't as interesting. You know, I could have stayed as long as I wanted, to just do like event photos of the mayor at different ribbon cuttings, blah, blah, blah. But like, that wasn't what I wanted. And I also was eager to think about if teaching really was the right path for me, you know, because photojournalism I thought would be right. It wasn't. Is teaching going to be right? I thought so, because I was lucky that I was able to TA a lot as an undergraduate. So that taught me like, oh, I do like this feeling a lot. But I wanted to explore that. And one of the things I've also been really interested in throughout my career, and like very much led me here, is the notion of privilege in terms of who has access to a camera, who has access to telling their story. So one thing I did that last year I was there in Boston that was really impactful for me is I spearheaded a kind of random, it was teaching at a nonprofit. I was teaching photography to victims of domestic sex trafficking who were living in basically like residential treatment centers. And the idea was, you know, these girls have been through a lot. Let's give them a camera, let them tell their stories. And
use it as a creative outlet.
Yeah.
That had been for you in the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, it was really powerful. I would say it also made me aware of some of the issues with those programs, because I loved working with my girls. They loved the project. And I would say it was very successful. I mean, we put up an exhibit in Boston City Hall, and they gave public speeches while a lot of significant politicians were there to hear their stories and think about how, you know, social change could help in the future. But the one thing that kills me is a program like that can be, I just wish I had found a way to make it sustainable for the students to maintain their photography practice after.
Like post project. Yeah.
Yeah. But that, I mean, they were high schoolers. That also gets into the question of like, you know, were they going to go to college, things like that. But that's just one thing I thought about, like leaving there. It was sort of like, this has been the most amazing experience. How could I make this like a forever experience for someone? How could I make it so that these girls could like be professional photographers? Like they really love it. What if they could do this? As opposed to like having it just be this like one iteration of telling their story, which was super powerful in of itself. But yeah, that sort of led me back to graduate school, wanting to teach in higher education, but also like still very much thinking about where I could have an impact, you know, where I could be helping people have access to telling their own story in a way that they might not have had in the past.
Exactly.
So
How can you arm them with the
exactly,
knowledge and resources to sort of take it
to
and make it
navigate a
sustainable?
career in the arts, you know,
Mhm.
and figure out how to keep going with it.
That's awesome.
So yeah, then I ended up back in school. I went to Duke for my MFA. My one of my mentors, my history of photography and large format photography mentor, Jim Dow,
Mhm.
told me Duke would be the perfect program for me. He was like totally convinced, more so than I was at first. Because I think I was also like still thinking in terms of hierarchy, you know, like the Yale MFA program for photography is the most prestigious in this country, you know, so it was sort of like, but if I do that, I could like be in galleries in New York. That's sort of like the sexy artist path. I mean, that is the path to the art world as a photographer.
Mhm.
And probably the best thing that could happen to me is I didn't get in. I ended up, I also visited all the programs I was considering. And as soon as I had conversations at Duke, I was like, oh gosh, yeah, I want to be here because they were like-minded. You know, it immediately felt like a community where they were thinking about not just making art, but like doing so in a really socially responsible way, thinking about giving back. It was the perfect fit for me. And Jim, part of why he pushed it is the person that created the program at Duke. I was part of the second cohort ever.
Wow.
Yeah, the person, Tom Rankin, who created it and was director of the program, still is, and was chair of my thesis committee. He had done the combined degree program 30 years earlier and studied with Jim.
That is amazing.
And Jim was like, I think you and Tom, you're just part of the same lineage. Just you go to Duke, at least talk, like figure, you know, he was like, I think this is where you'll find your voice. And he was absolutely right. And something I loved was that it was a brand new program. Because I think some of these grad programs, I noticed as I was like researching them, they become little assembly lines. Like everyone makes a certain type of work, you know, like I almost went to Columbia. Work tends to be much more conceptual, much more studio based. Makes sense. In New York City, like, and for me, that was another thing. Like Duke brought me south. And it was like, well, I don't know if I want to be there or not, but this would be a new landscape. This
Exactly.
would
Try
be
something new.
a new place to make work. And maybe that's what I need, you know, to take the next step in my practice and explore a part of America I don't know. Because my entire childhood was in the Northeast, but for when we were living abroad in Singapore. So but my dad's family is from the Midwest, but I would say it was a very like Northeast elite upbringing. And I think it was really good for me to go to Duke. I wouldn't have it any other way. I loved being there. I loved being there. I made a lifelong community, and that's huge in the arts. I think it's actually surprised me how much that matters, having community as an artist, but it does because it's not easy. So you need your people to commiserate with and cheer one another on and treat it like a team sport.
And just like you were saying with your teacher who recommended Duke to you, it was because he had kept in touch with his community.
Totally. And I'm still in touch with him. He was a reference for this job.
Wow.
Yes, he recently retired. He's now professor emeritus. His entire archive went to Duke. But yeah, he's still, something that actually meant a lot to me is he just published a book with Yale this year. And as he was writing his introductory essay, he sent it to me for feedback, which just felt like, whoa, okay, I'll try. But this was, I don't know, it was really nice because you get to a point also where your mentors become mentors and peers at the same time. And that feels a little mind-blowing and confusing, but also really nice.
This idea of like, you want to know what I think?
Yeah, totally.
You sort of reached a level where they want your advice too. You feel you're on the same level as them in a way.
Yeah.
Looking up to them for so long.
I mean, it just made me feel like, oh gosh, he respects what I think. Jeez. I mean, even though I knew that, he's always treated me that way, but I don't know. In terms of artistically, being in the South is a big part of it. I've been making my work in the rural South and about the rural South for the past decade now. And it's surprised me as much as anyone how engaged with the region I am. Again, another thing I would not have foreseen, but once it clicked, it clicked. So I guess I should also say, you know, while I was at the museum school, I started shooting color, large format photography. I was printing in the color darkroom, then, you know, scanning to inkjet. I kept with the exact same workflow. The only thing that was different was Duke pushed me to experiment with making films. And that was really great experience for me and something I really enjoy. Whether it's, you know, documentary or something more avant-garde, like a black and white silent film. I actually loved doing that. I loved
How was that?
And then put it, like seeing it on a projector. Oh my gosh, I loved that. And it made me a much better photographer because it made me really think more about a progression of images as a time-based piece, or like a book of photographs, as almost like thinking of it as a film. Like you want to think about the pacing, you want to think about all these things that helped me think about how photographs come together to be a body of work.
That is so cool. That
Yeah.
promoted this idea of like, try other things, try these new mediums. And it's, again, like you're saying, maybe that's not exactly what you're looking to do, but that'll teach you exactly what you need for what you're looking to do. That's awesome.
Totally. Yeah, it was fantastic. It was great because I would say at the museum school, I didn't take anything other than photography. You know, because I had distribution requirements at Tufts and I was doing both schools. When I was taking my art classes, it was photography. I took the history of photography and large format photography a lot of times each.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, yeah. But yeah, it was good for me because it was new and pushed me in that regard, but also the place was new. And it was also my first time trying to make a major body of work and thinking about how to bring it all together. And I had the craziest idea and I went with it and it was impossible. I wanted to do work about the post office because when I had been sitting at my desk back at the Boston Housing Authority, I read that like all these post offices were closing. I read it in the New York Times just one day at work when I was kind of bored. But it really stuck with me. And I think part of it might have been also how I was working in a similarly like bureaucratic place. I was just the post office. I had never thought about it. I just growing up, I took it for granted. Like, of course the mailman is going to get my letter to Santa. Okay. You know, like I believed in the USPS just because it seemed like part of the fabric of our society. And I had never noticed it. And when I thought about it, post offices closing or it not necessarily always being here,
It's mind-blowing.
Yeah, and it just made me want to think about that and also think about how it was kind of similar to some of the changes in photography. You know, fewer people were shooting film. Film was getting more expensive. I still wanted to shoot film, but you know, there's this analog to digital transition. And also photographs and letters to me are very similar. A photograph is like a handwritten letter that you send off and little. I think we're good now. It's like a handwritten letter that, you know, it's a story in of itself, but
Mhm.
also it's always something of the past by the time someone sees it. It's like this past moment that's traveled through time and space to someone
Nice.
else who has to interpret the story
Uh-huh.
or make sense of it. And that is, at that point, it's out of the letter writer's control. It's out of the photographer's control. You know, it's a message in a bottle. And I guess I just really sort of was intrigued by that and thought about that. And but what really made me focus on rural was the fact that rural post offices were closing,
Mhm.
not city post offices. But in the rural communities I was going to, like, boy, they needed that post office. It was the only thing in town. You know, like
You would think, yeah, because especially in the cities, there are
several.
many. Exactly.
Yeah. Why not just like close one of 10?
Exactly. Yeah.
Um, but yeah, and what was happening at that time is there were some communities where the post office was, everyone had PO boxes at the post office. There was no home delivery.
Mhm.
So the post office was the only address in the town. So if the post office closed, that town no longer had a zip code on the American map. So I
Wow.
mapped out what were, according to the data at that time in 2012 and 2013, the most threatened zip codes in the American South.
Mhm.
And I took a bunch of road trips. And I finally gave myself permission to photograph anything in that zip code. It didn't have to just be the post office, because at a certain point that just gets very repetitive.
Mhm.
And I think that's something that I'm always grappling with as a photographer, like making work about something, but also just wanting to embrace the best pictures, whatever's the best visually,
Mhm.
because that's the language. Um, so I don't know. That was it. It was really great to have the time and space and support at Duke to sort of wrap my mind around how to bring together this crazy idea and then be going to all these towns and making photographs and bring it all together. Um, but it was really great. I self-published a book that's long since sold out and had a solo show at a gallery that went really well. And it was a really great experience. It was a really great experience.
That is so cool that they've sort of armed you with the resources you needed to explore and then do all of those great things, like go on a road trip. Like that's awesome. I want to go on a road
Oh
trip
my
too.
gosh, I did a lot of road trips. I spent a lot of time on the road.
That is awesome.
And
Expanding those horizons.
yeah, and I also, because I was new in the region, I read Southern literature like crazy,
Mhm.
which I hadn't, I think I'd been exposed to some of like the greats, like everyone reads Faulkner, but I had never heard of Eudora Welty, who is my favorite author of all time now.
Mhm.
Love her work. She became like the muse for the project.
That is awesome.
Yeah, because I went through her correspondence,
Mhm.
her old letters. But yeah, and I think it also, one of the most important things I learned on that project was how to be on the road, but also be culturally sensitive and be thinking about like, I think they're very quickly in photography, it can turn into like pictures that are well intended in trying to expose a social issue, but also lead to visual stereotypes.
Mhm.
And as a lot, these small towns in the rural South, I mean, I was looking at rural poverty, probably more than I had in my life. I was very familiar with working class neighborhoods, having worked at the Boston Housing Authority, but urban and rural, it feels very different. And this was my first time really seeing that, engaging with that, and also thinking about how to visualize that in the ways I wanted to.
Mhm.
Um, and I think engaging with the literature and some of like the things that are just beautiful about the culture helped me really channel an energy that was like, you know what, I'm looking at these towns for what they are. The post office literally is the only thing left.
Mhm.
And there are many ways in which it's small and sad, and but also like trying to really be inspired by the assets of a place, not just the deficits, right? And I think in photography, if it can be very easy for pictures to focus on deficit.
Mhm.
And that's been something I've grappled with a lot. And I think that was I think that was a really important part of that journey for me.
That is awesome. This idea of, in order to really understand your craft, going into other mediums like your
Yes.
work. So
Yeah.
I've
Like
never heard that.
feeling like my own creativity was
Mhm.
so inspired by Eudora Welty's creativity. Like
Mhm.
her, all of her work, all, you know, her words were the message in a bottle to me. And it really helped me. I think it just helped me connect with the place and really grow to love a lot of what I was seeing in the rural South.
Mhm.
Not everything, but feel connected to the place. And that, you know, when I graduated from Duke, I knew I wanted to continue making my work in the rural South for a little bit longer.
Mhm.
I didn't really know what that was going to look like, but I felt by the end of the program, I was like, okay, I think I'm done with the post office for right now. But I did not feel like I was done exploring the rural South.
That is awesome. And it's become your home.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it probably will always be.
Uh-huh.
I mean, you never know. That's one thing life has taught me. I really have no idea. But
Mhm.
for the foreseeable future, I think so.
That is awesome. How this one creative passion of yours that you would do in secret in the dark room or like as a hobby for you became this thing that brought you all over the country and to
Yeah.
all these different communities and all these different people and experiences.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's been a pretty amazing journey. I feel very fortunate. And the years after Duke were similarly like hard but great.
Uh-huh.
I started teaching 2015, and but my first job out of grad school was working for a park ranger and making
Really?
photographs.
That is so interesting.
Led to the publication of my first book.
Wow.
It was another like 2-month thing, and I was just like, okay, I don't have anything else. They're going to pay me to make pictures. Great. Um, Went to, you know, East Tennessee, and I was to take photographs of old time musicians,
Mhm.
and I completely fell in love with the music. The regional music became sort of the next creative thing I was channeling in my own work. And that became the book Moonshine. I really, I fell in love with it there. I actually, so I went there for 2 months that summer. And
Uh-huh.
then I went back to North Carolina because I had another fellowship at Duke and I was teaching at Duke.
Mhm.
And as soon as the semester was over, I found a way. I basically made running a record label for a park ranger my full time job through AmeriCorps because I really wanted to find a way to get back. And the
Uh-huh.
park ranger called me. He was like, you know, we have this AmeriCorps position. I want to be putting out the music of the people you've been photographing. So I did it. I moved there and I was living in a trailer in a park, or I was all over the place between trailer to trailer. The main one was like this trailer that this parks pulled up. It had been a FEMA trailer during Hurricane Katrina,
Mhm.
and they just put it in the park. I was working in the park office. Home was a trailer in the campground. And
Wow.
otherwise, I was just continuing my work, spending time with these musicians, most of whom were elderly, and I just loved hearing their stories. Loved it.
So
I was
cool.
hanging out with like 95-year-olds that had grown up during the Depression in the mountains of Tennessee, and they were telling me about their life and like what it was like to, you know, go work in war factories during World War II as a woman. And I mean, I loved it. I had to stay.
That is so
So I
cool.
ended up finding like teaching work in the area so that I could stay there
Mhm.
to continue this project, which became really, really important to me. Because I got very, very close with the people I was photographing because I ended up spending years doing so. And I would, you know, stay over with them for weeks, months at a time. Um, and it, yeah, that, I mean, that was probably one of the, yeah, one of the most amazing experiences of my life.
And you, I mean, you've, like I said this before with like the literary works, you wouldn't think that something so different from photography, like music, could be so similar and so
I had never
entertaining.
heard a fiddle tune in my life. I had no idea what the difference between a fiddle and a violin was. And
Uh-huh.
like, I had never really engaged with music that didn't have lyrics. And like the ballads had lyrics, but they didn't have anything else. Like, it was just very different for me. And
Uh-huh.
I ate it all up. But I think it was also like, I've always loved listening to the elderly tell stories. And that's what I was doing. I encountered a small group of people in their 90s, and they opened up to me and shared their life story with me before they passed.
That is amazing.
Yeah, Evelyn in particular. I stayed with her a lot. She was
Mhm.
ornery. She was a very ornery old woman who loved to, you know, anytime took a picture, she said, "I gotta have my shotgun." She was, yeah, she was also hilarious, and I think part of why I connected with her too was she was just so her own person. You know, this was around when Donald Trump was becoming really popular, and she just saw through all of it, whereas a lot of people in her community were like, it was just a very interesting moment to be in that area, like, as all that was happening politically.
Mhm.
And I just loved hearing Evelyn's take on it, and she would sass everyone. I loved it.
That is
But yeah,
amazing.
she at one point she said, you know, "You're going to do the book on me, right?" And I said, "Yeah, I'd love to if you'll let me." And she gave me a lot of stuff, and she left a lot of stuff to me.
That is amazing. Sort of like leaving it to you to tell her story and
Yeah.
trusting you with
No,
that.
literally. Yeah, they were mostly songs she wrote,
Mhm.
old like handwritten song sheets in cursive.
Wow.
Yeah, they're in my book. They're the end papers.
That is amazing. And which book is this one? I want to write
It's
this down.
Moonshine. The only
Okay.
one you can get on Amazon is Moonshine.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I'm so
I'd be
intrigued.
happy to send you a copy if you just give me your address or something. Just shoot me an
Perfect.
email with your address and I'll stick one in the mail. A
Thank you.
yeah, I have a bunch.
I'm excited to take a look. Thank you.
Yeah.
Um, One other question I have for you is you took me toward like through this amazing journey of yours, and how it sort of became so much from this feeling of being unsure and not sure if you wanted to take this risk, rather than like pursuing a more practical path with your like practical major and practical classes and the one
Yeah.
photography class you were taking. So I was just wondering what advice you had for young creatives who are sort of in between that, like I want to follow my passion, but I'm worried that I can't.
You have to follow it.
Mhm.
I mean, I think the people that really stick with it are the people that can't not.
Mhm.
Um, but I think it's worth seeing what it could be because truthfully, as I've thought about it, like, okay, all these majors I had labeled as being like practical, you know,
Mhm.
like history, sociology. It's not really, I mean, it ends up in the same career path as me, right? Teaching, being a professor, being an academic. Great. Um, you know, the obvious ones that I guess are more, for me, I felt like a lot of people, you know, majored in something just to major in something because it's the liberal arts and you can do whatever. Um,
Mhm.
and I would say an astonishing number of people I knew just went into marketing. Um, And I don't know, I think there were definitely times when I was jealous. Because it was sort of like, okay, well, I'm here in my FEMA trailer and, you own a really nice apartment in New York City. Like, I think that was the only thing that sort of messed with me at certain times. It was sort of like the age thing and being like, well, I'm living this beautiful adventure I love, but like, I'm approaching 30. Where's this going? Like, how, and there would be times when I'd feel really jealous of people who seemed like they were adults in a way that I was not. I wouldn't trade it for the world. I mean, I also think the path I've chosen is one I've made for myself, and it's one that's truly sustainable because it's tailor-made for me. I am where I want to be, doing what I want to do. These are all decisions I consciously made and went through the arduous process of figuring out what I did want, what that looked like, and finding the fit. And I think some of the immediate rewards of perhaps working in marketing, while they might have been tempting for me at a certain point, they don't seem tempting to me now, because it's just sort of like what I do allows me to have an adventure all the time.
I love that.
Like, it's not limited to Tennessee, or it's just sort of like opened it up so that I'm constantly learning because I'm looking at things I'm curious about with a lens. And it makes for a really enriching life experience that is not conducive to boredom. Even in quarantine, I mean, I actually made some interesting still life images. I mean, it's like, but I think it's also just, I'm glad I kind of got off the beaten path, because I think I discovered a love for things I never would have known. Yeah, I mean, I think my partner is very similar. I mean, he's from rural Kentucky. He has a GED. He did not go to college. He would have loved the experience of college had he had the privilege to go, but that was not something available to him. I never would have met him if it wasn't for photography. But he makes me incredibly happy. And it's helped me to open myself up to experiences and adventures that I don't know. I think if I was constantly thinking about, like, is this practical? It would just be a very closed off life. And I wouldn't want that.
That is amazing.
I love having a squirrel for the past 3 weeks. And, like, it's.
Yeah. Like, every day is a new adventure because you're just trying new things, like owning a squirrel.
I mean, I'll be very honest. Teaching is a job like anything else, and there are always going to be parts of a job that are not fun. I teach at a state school that has very limited resources. Some of the bureaucracy can be, but it's where I want to be. It's where I want to be. I mean, the students I'm working with are basically people I've seen in my pictures, and I want them to make pictures too. I shouldn't be the only one with a camera.
I love that. Like, sort of spreading the wealth and giving other people this opportunity, like you were saying before, encouraging the sustainability in the profession of photography.
And that's one of the things that I do feel I'm able to do at a place like Arkansas State, which is affordable for, 18-year-olds in Northeast Arkansas who have never been out of the state and are thinking about how to live a creative life, whatever that looks like. The students I'm working with, truthfully, have had very little education compared to what someone graduating from Right Country Day has had. I mean, I have to teach what a complete sentence is. That's not something that anyone comes to Arkansas State knowing. And it's not necessarily something that's like a priority in a photography class, but I usually do get there when I realize, it's not something they know. But,
Mhm.
I want them to be able to pursue their passion as well.
I love that. That is amazing. Oh my goodness. That is so touching.
Well, I just, photography is something that I think, because it's one of the most expensive
Mhm.
artistic media, because it's technological. Um, and in the past, it was the chemistry, there's always something where it's been an expense, and it's something that has very frequently been available to people with money only.
Mhm.
And now we're getting to a moment where people are thinking more broadly about things. The medium itself has become more accessible, and I think that's something to take advantage of.
That is amazing. That is awesome. Yeah, exactly. Especially since the fact that it could be done digitally and so accessibly now. You can take wonderful photos on your phone or take wonderful photos using like a hand-me-down camera or something like
Right.
that. That is awesome.
Yeah. But also, students at this point, they've never worked with film or a dark room. And I teach both digital and dark room. And the dark room is a totally new experience for these students. They don't even, it's totally new.
That is amazing. That is so cool, especially since that was your home basically 3 times a week overnight, where you would
Yeah.
just stay in there. Being able to share that with other people must be so amazing and gratifying.
It's gratifying. It's disappointing when they don't take to it. I'm like any teacher, you know, it's a mixed bag. But
Mhm.
you have to be in it for the people you're reaching.
Exactly.
That I photography is a required class for any art and design major at
Mhm.
Arkansas State. Not all of them are going to love photography, but it's about like really thinking about who you are impacting, who you are connecting with, and hanging on to that.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thank you, thank
absolutely.
you, thank you.